Hello. Go ahead and turn your books to lesson 66. That is page 471. We are going to go step by step with this. This might be a little bit longer of a video, but the things that you need to know, and I'll have it down here in over there, the Dropbox there, to tell you that there are some lessons that pertain to this. So if you haven't watched it, if you didn't do the quizzes, I highly recommend that you go back. So I'll have the lesson number for quadratic formula, for synthetic division, and just a reminder, whenever you factor, because this deals with factoring when it's very, very complicated and there's no like terms, no nothing that you can factor out, you always factor out the common factor first. That's always the first rule of factoring. Example 1, we are factoring this this group. It's a polynomial 1, 2, 3. It's a trinomial. But in this case, it looks a little bit more complicated. It's not like what we usually see, the ax squared plus bx plus c. Here, to factor this, you always factor out common factor. There is a number in common. That number is 2. There's also a variable in common, which is x squared. You always want to factor out the smallest of the x exponents. When you do that, you end up with x squared minus 5x minus 36, and this is all equal to 0. Now, it looks like with the parentheses here, this is factored out. It looks like we can factor this in here. It looks like we can factor out evenly, so it's a trial and error type of factoring. So factors of negative 36 that equal negative 5, and I get 4 and negative 9. So that means you'll have x is x plus 4, and you'll have x minus 9, and then you have your factors there. When you're looking for your roots, when you're trying to factor as much as you can, especially when it's equal 0, this is the biggest indication that you need to find what x is. In this case here, we have 3 different types of solutions what x could be. We have 2x squared, and we set everything equal to 0. So first, make sure everything is thoroughly factored. Next, set everything equal to 0. So 2x squared equals 0, divide by 2. X squared equals 0, or square root it. And then you have x is equal to 0. That's one of your answers. Next one, x plus 4, set it equal to 0. Subtract 4 to both sides. X is equal to negative 4. That's your second answer. Third one, x minus 9 equals 0. Set that binomial equal to 0. Add 9 to both sides to get the x by itself. X is equal to 9. And those are your 3 solutions. If you have them working in different ways, it's still... I'll look through the answers for your homework and your quizzes to see if they're right or wrong. And if they're misplaced, I'll say that they're right. I'll go back and I change the grades if you see the x's there. Here, B, we're going to factor this out. We can't factor this out because nothing's on one side. You have to make sure that it's set equal to 0 before you factor out anything. That means we have to move this over. Negative 4x squared to both sides. We have 4x cubed minus 4x squared plus x is equal to 0. Then we start factoring. Numbers, we cannot factor anything there. We could factor out an x though. So we have 4x squared minus 4x plus 1. And therefore we have that. In this case here, we have a trinomial, but remember, this trinomial, the a is greater than 1. So if we go through the trinomial greater than 1, I'll go through this quickly. Multiply a and c, that's positive 4. You want factors that equal negative 4, that's negative 2 and negative 2. Bring down your first term, bring down your last term. 4x squared, the plus 1. These 2 will be your middle terms, so negative 2x, another negative 2x. You factor the first 2, factor the second 2. This is a review. Then you get 2x times 2x minus 1. Here, whenever you have your first term that's a negative, you have to make sure you factor out that negative. So you can't factor out anything else. You can't factor out 1 or an x. So you have negative 2x, 1 divided by negative 1, minus 1. Then you factor out the common factor, 2x minus 1, there. And what you're left with is 2x minus 1. So here, this turns into x times 2x minus 1 times 2x minus 1. And now, we're thoroughly factored. Now we go ahead and set each of these equal to 0. We have that one solved. If you solve for x for this one, x is equal to positive 1/2. And the same thing over here, positive 1/2. So your answer is 0 and 1/2. Keep in mind, it's repeated twice, but we're not gonna put it down twice. There's a word called, if I can say this right, multiplicity. Multiplicity is just simply how they are repeated. In this case here, we have x is equal to 1/2, but the multiplicity of 1/2 is 2 because it appeared twice. Now let's do that for example 2. Here we have to find the roots, and we have to give the multiplicity of each equation here. Now we factor. You can see here that you can't really factor anything out except the x. You always look for the least of the 3, which is x cubed. When you factor out the x cubed, you get x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 0. So we're trying to factor and solve for x. Keep on going. X cubed here, that one we factor out, we have to leave it there. We factor out this. 16, factors of 16 that equal 8 is x plus 4 and the x plus 4. Sorry, I meant to put the 0. Now, we set each of these equal to 0. Here, x cubed is equal to 0. The answer would be 0 because x times x times x, one number will give us x 3 times, that will equal 0, and that would be 0. One number that you multiply 3 times that gives you 0 would be 0 in this case because the cube root of 0 is 0. So here the first answer is 0, but it has a multiplicity of 3. X cubed, there are 3 of the x's there that you multiply 3 times to get that 0. So the answer is x equals 0, but it has a multiplicity of 3. Next one, the x plus 4 and the other x plus 4. We set each of these equal to 0. If you notice, they are the same exact binomial. So the answer is 0 with a multiplicity of 3 and negative 4 with a multiplicity of 2 because it appeared twice. So when they ask you for those two things, make sure you write them down. It will be on your homework assignment. I would recommend you writing it this way, 0 with like this, to shorten this much, I would recommend writing it like that. Next one, we're going to deal with the rational root theorem. This can get a little complicated if you don't remember how to use synthetic division and quadratic formula. Here we have this whole thing here. We can't factor out common factor. We can't factor out the normal way. Out of those 7, 8 different ways that we learned, we cannot factor out any way. But they still want us to find the root. So to find the root, we have to go ahead and use a rational root theorem. Meaning, you first find your factors of c. You're going to have those numbers, and you're going to divide it by the factors of the leading coefficient. So let's start with that. Factors of 12 is 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Those are your factors. You're going to be dividing them. But not only are you dividing by the 1 and 12, it's also negative 1 and negative 12, right? So plus or minus each of these. So plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2, plus or minus 3, plus or minus 4, plus or minus 6, plus or minus 12. So you find factors of your C. And it's going to be a plus or minus because of the fact that it could be positive or it could be negative. It's a positive answer. Or it's a positive number, so you get both. Next one, you divide it by the factors of your leading coefficient. My leading coefficient is x cubed 3. The only factors of that 1 is 1. So that means over 1. Positive or negative 1. 1 times 1 equals 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 equals 1. After that, we have to divide. The reason why we're doing this is because we're going to be using synthetic division. We're going to be using certain numbers to solve our roots. Now here, you're going to be dividing. Plus or minus 1 divided by plus or minus 1 gives us plus or minus 1. Plus or minus 2 divided by plus or minus 1, 2. And if you know it's anything over 1 is the same number. So I'll have 3, I'll have 4, I'll have 6, I'll have 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's actually 12 different answers that you can choose from to use synthetic division. And that is step 2, to use synthetic division. There are, again, there are 2 different answers for each one. Positive 1, negative 1, positive 2, negative 2, positive 3, negative 3, positive 4, etc., etc. So you're going to be using each of the numbers. So what I did was I used the first one. So plus or negative 1, I'm going to start with just the 1 itself. So when I use synthetic division, I have my number here. Remember, this always represents x minus a, and x, in this case, will be x minus 1. So we're using the first one, starting from left to right. So it's 1. Then we write down our coefficients of each one. So if I'm going across, it's 1, negative 2, negative 11, and 12. This is review for synthetic division. You always bring your first term down. Then you do 1 times 1, which is 1. Negative 2 plus 1, you're going to be adding. So negative 2 plus 1 is negative 1. Negative 1 times 1, negative 1. Negative 11 minus 1 gives you negative 12. 1 times 12 gives you negative 12. So you're going to bring that over here. 12 minus 12, you get 0. Whenever you have a 0 in the end, that means it's a factor. And that's what you're going to be doing. You might be doing synthetic division 10 times, but you're solving until you get a factor, meaning you'll have that 0 in the end. So since that is a factor, you have x minus 1. That number that you use, that's one of your options that you use from here. So you're not using random numbers, you're using specific numbers. You're using actually 12 or 6 different numbers here. Now you have x minus 1 times, and it goes back to synthetic division, your constant, your x, and your x squared. So it's going to be 1x squared minus x minus 12. In this case, now we have a simplified version of this polynomial up here. Now we go ahead and step 3, you factor again. So in this case here, x minus 1 times x squared minus x minus 12, there are factors that I could simplify this here. And that is negative 4 and positive 3. Negative 12, that means one of your factors is negative. Negative 4 times 3 gives you 12. Negative 4 plus 3 gives you negative 1, and it works out well. Now you find factors of each one, meaning you set each of these equal to 0. Everything's always set equal to 0. Now, set it equal to 0, then your answer is 1, x equals 1, x equals 4, and x equals negative 3. And that is your answer, and those are your roots. We're not going to find the multiplicity of each one. We're just trying to solve it out. So these are more complicated polynomials than what you've learned before. Next one, B. B is where it gets a little bit more complicated because now we have different types of polynomials, and it gets more complicated because of that. So now, let's go ahead and factor. I'm actually going to make 2 videos